They wanted him on his knees. Not for prayer, not for ceremony, not for any reason that made sense, just power, pure and simple. But the royal guard had buried too many friends to kneel for the wrong reasons. So when the king's advisor tried to make an example out of him, turning a decorated soldier into a public test of obedience, it wasn't the guard who broke protocol. It was the little prince standing on the platform and what he said. Stepping down alone between power and principle didn't just silence the courtyard, it changed everything. But before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, you've never seen anything like what this boy did, make sure you hit that subscribe button with notifications on. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Because this wasn't about protocol. This wasn't about tradition. This was about a child who understood honor better than the adults around him, and what he did next will restore your faith in the future of the monarchy. Windsor Castle wore autumn-like, old velvet rich and worn at the edges. Its ancient stone walls, centuries old yet stubbornly proud, absorbed the fading sunlight and radiated a warmth that belied their cold, hard surfaces. The late afternoon sun draped itself over the castle like a golden shawl, catching each carved crest and turret in a soft amber glow. Shadows stretched lazily across the cobblestone courtyards, mingling with the crisp rustle of fallen leaves, turning them into a mosaic of orange, brown, and gold. Even the moss that had taken root in the cracks seemed gilded in the light, a reminder that nature, too, was part of the ceremony. Flags fluttered high above the ramparts, their colors vivid against the pale sky, stirred gently by the breeze. Brass fittings on ceremonial barriers reflected the sun in sharp bursts, momentarily blinding anyone who wasn't careful with their gaze. Tourists pressed 3 or 4 deep against the ropes, craning their necks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the spectacle about to unfold. Their faces were a mixture of awe, impatience, and the perpetual need to capture a moment forever on camera. Cameras clicked in the familiar rhythm of royal events, some operated by professionals who had honed their craft over decades, their lenses long and intimidating, while others were smartphones raised high above heads, screens glowing like tiny beacons in the fading light. Near the west gate, a small group had gathered slightly apart from the main crowd. Among them, an American girl, no older than 10, waved a souvenir Union Jack with uncontainable enthusiasm. Her mother, glancing nervously at the press of bodies, whispered almost apologetically, "That's him. That's the king." She was pointing toward the royal platform where the expected ceremony was about to take place. A wave, a brief address, a handshake or two. Everything as protocol demanded. And yet 30 paces away from the platform, every lens, every eye, in fact, was actually focused on someone else entirely. The man in scarlet stood apart, a figure so perfectly still that for a heartbeat, one might have thought he was a statue. His posture was impeccable, the sort of precision that came not from rigid training alone, but from a deep, unspoken understanding of duty. He looked as if he had been carved from the stone itself, shaped by the centuries, by the echoes of those who had stood there before him. The crowd may have expected the pomp and pageantry of royalty to draw their attention, but it was the quiet, unassuming presence of this man, the royal guard, that captivated them instead. There was something almost magnetic about the way he held himself, disciplined yet human, commanding yet invisible unless one truly looked. Every detail of his uniform seemed perfect. The scarlet tunic clung just so to his broad shoulders, its buttons gleaming with polished precision. The ceremonial sword at his side reflected the sunlight, and the faint glint of the metal made it seem almost alive. On his head rested the traditional bearskin, towering and imposing, yet not so much that it overshadowed the man himself. Even the slight shift of weight from one foot to the other carried a rhythm, measured and deliberate, that spoke of years of experience and a life dedicated entirely to service. The crowd, oblivious to the finer points of guard protocol, mistook his stillness for stiffness. But anyone who knew the subtleties of his role could see the stories etched into every line of his stance, the careful balance of readiness and restraint, the silent promise that he would act if anything threatened. The sanctity of the royal grounds. Children craned their necks, wide-eyed, as parents attempted to explain the fascination. "He's just a guard," they said, but even their voices carried a note of wonder, as though they sensed the weight of history standing so quietly before them. And then there was the small, almost imperceptible moment that truly shifted the atmosphere. A royal advisor, robed in his black and gold attire, approached with a confident stride, his steps echoing sharply against the stones. He had a purpose, and that purpose was power, the kind that demanded submission. He paused just before the scarlet figure and gave a pointed nod, a signal meant only for the guard. The crowd had no way of knowing, but every movement here was loaded with significance. The advisor expected obedience, a bending of the body that would reduce a decorated soldier to a mere example, a warning to others about the supremacy of protocol over conscience. But the guard did not move. His eyes remained forward, fixed on some distant point that perhaps only he could see. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. In that brief, charged moment, the air seemed to thicken, the autumn light momentarily dimmed by the weight of intention. The advisor's jaw tightened, and for a split second, it seemed the world itself held its breath. And then came the interruption nobody anticipated, the small, fearless voice of the little prince. He stepped forward onto the platform alone, tiny yet unyielding in his courage. The words he spoke carried over the hush of the crowd, clear and resolute, a proclamation that shifted the balance of power in that moment. What he said did not merely challenge protocol, it reframed it. It turned the gaze of the crowd, of the cameras, of the king's own advisors, toward something purer, something far greater than authority for authority's sake. In that instant, the focus of Windsor Castle, autumn velvet and all, was not the monarch, not the ceremony, but a quiet man in scarlet who stood steadfast, and a child who understood the true meaning of courage. The crowd, sensing the disruption, yet unsure of its significance, murmured softly. The guards on either side of the platform stiffened slightly, and even the photographers lowered their lenses for a heartbeat, witnessing a moment that would not be repeated. Tourists, still waving, flags and clicking cameras, began to notice what had truly mattered all along, and above it all, the castle itself seemed to exhale, as if recognizing the alignment of honor, bravery, and legacy that had unfolded in its ancient courtyards. This scene, fleeting yet eternal, captured something rarely seen outside the quiet. Halls of history books. The interplay of power and principle, of ceremony and conscience, of the past meeting the present in a single, unbreakable moment. Windsor Castle, bathed in amber light and rustling leaves, held the story in its stones as tightly as it held centuries of tradition. And the man in scarlet, still and resolute, became more than a guard. He became a symbol, a reminder that true strength often resides not in authority alone, but in the courage to stand firm, even when no one demands it. The crowd, the cameras, the flags, the golden autumn light, they were all witnesses. But the heart of the moment, the silent core that would linger long after the day had ended, belonged to the man who stood like stone and the little prince who dared to speak, reminding everyone that in the theater of power, character often plays the lead role. Sergeant Alaric Drummond held his position with the kind of stillness that came from surviving places where moving at the wrong moment meant not going home. 6'3" in his ceremonial boots, shoulders squared with unwavering discipline, rifle cradled with parade ground precision, he was the embodiment of control. A pale scar curved beneath his right brow, a souvenir from a firefight outside Sanguine that had claimed half his unit and left him with a limp, he had learned to mask beneath the careful symmetry of ceremonial dress. To the tourists pressed against the ropes, he was a symbol of tradition, a living icon. To the press, he was a photograph waiting to happen, a line of scarlet interrupted only by the rigid discipline of a trained soldier. But Drummond saw everything else. Two aides whispered behind the inner rope line, overdressed for a late-afternoon ceremony that might have been grander on paper than on the ground. A royal photographer adjusted his lens, not toward the dais, but toward the guard formation. The careful click of the camera shutter punctuated the otherwise quiet ritual. A thin man, leather folder tucked under one arm, paced near the platform, pausing now and then to scribble notes with meticulous care. Someone Drummond didn't recognize, automatically making him a person of interest. In Helmand, staying alive meant noticing what others didn't. In Windsor, the battlefield had changed. No bullets, no blood in the dust, but the discipline, the tension, the awareness. It was all still the same. One breath every 8 seconds. Eyes fixed forward, mind cataloging every deviation from the norm. Right now, something felt wrong. It started as a murmur from the platform behind him, soft enough that the crowd wouldn't hear it. But Drummond's ears were trained to catch the conversations that mattered. The subtle shifts in tone, the weight of insinuation behind polished words. "Your Majesty, see how he stares, as if above command." The voice was smooth, cultured, dangerous in its quiet power. Drummond had heard that tone before, the type that issued orders from air-conditioned offices while other men bled in sand. He didn't turn, couldn't. His posture was law, but his shoulders tensed ever so slightly. Something was coming. Lord Peregrine Harrow, the advisor, had perfected the art of being indispensable. 3 monarchs, countless ceremonies, always hovering just close enough to whisper into the right ear at the right moment. He never raised his voice because he never needed to. Influence whispered was more effective than influence shouted. Now, he leaned toward King Charles with an intimacy that was at once practiced and precise. "Look at him, Majesty, rigid as a monument. When protocol becomes pride, it stops serving the crown." The king's eyes remained on the ceremonial program in his lap, a thin gold line of attention that betrayed nothing. Harrow continued. "He's the same guard from the Nigerian visit. Wouldn't step aside for their security detail, caused a whole diplomatic delay." "Did he break protocol?" the king asked without looking up. "He followed regulations." "Yes," Harrow said carefully, savoring the cadence of his words. "But sometimes loyalty needs to be demonstrated, not just assumed. The press have been questioning whether our ceremonial guards are mere decoration or genuine servants of the crown. A simple gesture would end all speculation. It would photograph beautifully, tradition and humility combined. Very reassuring to our critics." King Charles said nothing. That silence, deliberate and patient, was all Harrow needed. He descended the platform steps with the confidence of a man who already believed the argument won. Clipboard tucked under his arm like a royal mandate, he moved with the certainty of someone whose influence had never been denied. 2 younger aides followed behind, tentative in their footsteps, hesitant shadows of authority. The crowd parted, instinctively, as if sensing that something unusual was approaching, and so did a security officer, stepping aside to make way for the intrusion. One of the press photographers even lowered his lens slightly, aware that he was about to capture. A confrontation unlike the usual smiles and waves. Harrow stopped directly in front of Sergeant Drummond. The guard's eyes remained forward, blank slate in scarlet, shoulders locked in the stubborn perfection of someone trained to ignore distractions. Protocol forbade acknowledgement. Experience demanded it. The 2 principals collided in a silent tension that radiated outward, unnoticed by the cheering tourists and the clicking lenses. Harrow spoke without raising his voice. Every word was surgical. "Sergeant Drummond," he began, his tone neutral but carrying the weight of expectation, A simple bow, a small gesture for the press, for tradition, for the crown. Drummond didn't flinch. His mind ran a checklist. Timing, distance, angles, probable reactions. He cataloged the crowd's expressions, some puzzled, some oblivious, some anticipating the impending display of compliance. He noted the young mother adjusting her child on her hip, the elderly couple craning their necks, hoping to catch a royal glance. Every detail mattered. Harrow leaned closer, just enough for Drummond to sense the sharp tang of expensive cologne mixed with authority. "Show humility, Sergeant," he said. "It is not just ceremony, it is duty." The word duty hung in the air like a trap door ready to swing open. Drummond's fingers tightened ever so slightly on the polished wood of his rifle. He considered the implications. Yielding for the sake of optics could compromise years of disciplined service. Standing firm could cause a scene, disrupt protocol, perhaps even bring reproach. Yet every instinct he had honed under fire screamed at him. Do not bend without reason. Do not betray the code that has preserved your life more times than luck could count. Around them, the ceremonial rhythm continued as if nothing had changed. Brass fittings gleamed in the soft sunlight, flags fluttered high above the platform, and the crowd remained unaware of the subtle war unfolding on the stones of Windsor. Drummond's heartbeat was steady, measured, his mind a steel trap. Every glance, every movement, every subtle shift in weight was analyzed and stored. He did not flinch, he did not bow, he did not acknowledge the man who expected obedience without. Question Harrow, trained in the art of quiet power, found his patience tested. Most would have yielded by now. Most would have bent, just enough to satisfy the appearance of compliance. But Drummond was no ordinary soldier. His loyalty was not to appearances, nor to the optics of a fleeting moment. His loyalty was to the discipline, the code, the unspoken promise to himself and those who had fallen beside him. And so the tension stretched. Time became elastic, each second loaded with the potential for confrontation. The crowd watched, unconsciously holding their collective breath. The ceremonial ritual continued in the background, the music, the polished brass, the orderly rows of guards, but all of it now existed around the nucleus of the standoff between a man trained in the art of survival and a man trained in the art of manipulation. Neither could afford to blink. In that frozen, charged moment, Windsor Castle itself seemed to acknowledge the weight of history standing on its stones. This was not a simple matter of ceremony or photography. This was about principle, honor, and the quiet strength of a man who had learned the hardest way what it meant to stand your ground. And as Lord Harrow prepared to speak again, confident, precise, and smooth, Sergeant Alaric Drummond remained immovable, ready for whatever would come next. He knew that guard, not his name, not his story, but the face. Drummond was one of the constants, always at his post during state visits, never smiling during ceremonies, never looking anywhere except where duty demanded. He held his position like the entire monarchy depended on his vigilance, and in George's young mind, that kind of unwavering steadiness had always seemed almost superhuman. Watching Lord Harrow circle the man now, like a predator, made the boy's stomach tighten. George couldn't hear every word, but tone told the story. Harrow's voice carried the practiced condescension of a man used to bending the will of others without raising it above polite conversation. The energy in the crowd had shifted, imperceptibly at first, from celebration to spectacle. Cameras pivoted from the royal platform to the confrontation below. Tourists murmured, flashes stuttered. The air was thick with anticipation. George glanced at his grandfather. King Charles sat motionless, face unreadable, one hand resting on the arm of his chair. Always composed, always measured. Yet the boy's attention returned instantly to the scene unfolding before him. Harrow's voice had risen just enough for his final demand to carry across the forecourt. One knee, or be gone. George's heart hammered. Every lesson drilled into him about protocol, silence, and poise collided with a deeper, more primal sense of justice. This wasn't about ceremony or hierarchy. This was someone being bullied for doing precisely what he had been trained to do. George scanned his father, Prince William, who was deep in conversation with a diplomatic guest, oblivious to the subtle but dangerous power play taking place. And then he looked back at King Charles, still unmoving. In that instant, clarity crystallized in the boy's chest. Responsibility. The weight of observation didn't terrify him, it focused him. Every eye in the forecourt rested on Drummond, yet no one stood beside him. George's knuckles went white against the armrest. History whispered through his memory, a phrase repeated countless times in lessons and stories. Royalty exists to protect those who protect us. This wasn't just theory. This was now. The brass band's notes dwindled into silence, leaving a tension so thick it could have been cut with ceremonial swords. Harrow's voice climbed higher, straining for theatrics, for compliance, for the optics he craved. And yet Sergeant Drummond remained unmoved, an island of perfect posture in a sea of expectation. George inhaled sharply, but said nothing. He watched, coiled and ready, waiting for the moment when inaction would become complicity. Harrow took a deliberate step back, boots clicking against the stone, a sound that echoed louder than his words. The crowd had gone silent, not the respectful hush of ceremony, but the electric pause that precedes lightning. Drummond's stillness had become a form of resistance itself. Harrow, unused to being ignored, especially under the relentless gaze of cameras, turned sharply to the aides hovering behind him. "Remove him!" The words were quiet, almost casual, but their effect was instantaneous. One aide hesitated. "Sir, we—" Harrow silenced him with a look sharp enough to cut through steel. "The king hasn't objected," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This is about discipline. We won't let disobedience fester." On the platform, King Charles shifted, lips parted as if to speak, but Harrow leaned close, whispering with that practiced urgency. "Strength, Majesty, let it happen." The king's mouth closed, and the aides moved forward, hesitant, reluctant. Drummond's rifle never wavered, his posture never broke. When he spoke, his voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "Touch me and you violate ceremonial protocol. The king's own regulations, not mine." The words stopped them for a heartbeat, but Harrow's smile persisted, carefully calculated. The optics of authority challenged and answered were exactly what he sought. And then it happened. Everything changed. A single decisive movement from the platform. Prince George rose. Every camera in the forecourt pivoted instantly. Gasps spread through the crowd. Reporters, palace staff, tourists alike. The boy did not run, shout, or gesture. He simply stood, perfect posture drilled into him since early childhood. For a moment, it seemed choreographed, but it wasn't. It was quiet revolution. In powder blue jacket and polished shoes, the 11-year-old took his first measured step down the platform stairs. Eyes fixed ahead, spine rigid, he moved with the certainty that only preparation, clarity, and moral conviction can grant. Prince William noticed first, brow furrowed in concern, but did not intervene. King Charles turned slowly, surveying his grandson, then Harrow, then the guard who had not budged. The aides froze mid-approach. Harrow's confidence flickered for the first time. The crowd's silence became profound. Musicians lowered instruments. The clatter of ceremonial noise vanished. In the middle of all the gold braid, polished boots, and centuries of protocol, a child had chosen his side and walked straight toward it. Each soft step George took on the worn flagstone echoed like thunder, slowing time itself. Shutters clicked in rapid succession. Gaze after gaze swung from Harrow to the boy. He did not hurry, did not pose, did not announce himself. He simply moved the way his tutors had taught him to carry himself, with dignity, purpose, and quiet authority. By the time George reached the base of the platform, tourists had lowered their phones. Children stared. Reporters froze. He crossed the ceremonial space until he stood beside Sergeant Drummond. The guard did not turn. Protocol forbade it. George did not expect him to. Instead, he stepped forward, half a pace in front of Drummond's shoulder. His small frame was dwarfed by the scarlet-clad figure, yet his presence seemed to fill the forecourt. Lord Harrow's face went pale, though he masked it with a sneer. "Your Highness, this is not your concern," George lifted his chin. "It is when someone who stands for us is being humiliated for doing exactly that." His voice rang clear, carried by the open air, captured by every microphone. Harrow glanced toward King Charles. Still, the monarch remained silent. George spoke again, stronger, deliberate. "He will not kneel. He stands for Britain, and so do I." Drummond didn't nod, didn't speak, yet something shifted in him. Jaw tightening, posture even straighter, recognition passing without a word. Harrow's lips parted, no sound emerging. The aides froze. The forecourt seemed to exhale. The child had drawn a line in the sand in full view of crown, cameras, and citizens alike. Without shouting, without force, George became the loudest voice in the square. Lord Harrow stepped back a single pace. Not defeat, not yet, but a first crack. "Your Majesty," he called, trying to rally support. "The boy misunderstands." This was symbolic, a unifying gesture. King Charles regarded him with quiet weariness. Not anger, not coldness, just the exhaustion of a man who had seen games played in shadows for decades. The king did not speak. Harrow tried again, now toward the cameras. The guard refused a direct request made in respect. "We must maintain ceremonial discipline." George's voice cut through, unwavering. He didn't refuse out of pride. He refused because some things aren't meant to be performed. The courtyard held its collective breath. A child had defended a man, principles over protocol, and in that silence the hierarchy of power had subtly shifted. A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. Even those who didn't grasp every nuance understood that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer merely advisor versus soldier. It had become power confronting principle. The forecourt, normally a stage of rehearsed pageantry and predictable gestures, now held an unscripted moment, fragile and electric. The press snapped images furiously, tourists whispered, and palace staff froze mid-step, sensing the gravity. Without needing context, King Charles finally rose from his seat, not with the flourish of command, not with theatrical urgency, but with the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed simply by presence. Each step was deliberate, measured, his polished shoes clicking softly against the worn flagstone. His gaze moved from Harrow to George, then to Drummond, and back again to his senior advisor. No rehearsal, no protocol had ever prepared any of them for this precise alignment of events. For a long, tense beat, it seemed the king might remain silent again. Harrow, sensing the pause, straightened, eyes flicking anxiously between the king and the boy who had dared to intervene. But then King Charles spoke, his voice low, calm, yet cutting through the murmurs like a ceremonial sword through silk. "That's enough, Lord Harrow." The words dropped into the forecourt like final judgment, unmistakable in their authority. The murmurs halted, shutter clicks stilled. Harrow blinked, as if searching for a qualifier, a hint that this was not what it seemed. "Majesty," he began, voice tight with disbelief. "Enough," Charles repeated, firmer now, his tone leaving no room for negotiation or protest. This is neither the place for your instruction nor the man for your experiments. The effect on Harrow was subtle but complete. His carefully composed exterior seemed to collapse inward, not in theatrics, but with the quiet gravity of someone realizing the boundaries of their power had been exceeded. His spine straightened only in defiance of posture. Inwardly, he shrank under the weight of disapproval. The clipboard he clutched, once armor against scrutiny, now felt like a shield turned brittle. George, standing tall despite his small frame, took a step forward, turning to face his grandfather. His voice, calm yet resonant, carried across the courtyard. He stands. King Charles, to the quiet astonishment of even his security detail, repeated the words aloud, loud enough for every ear in the forecourt to hear. He stands. No further elaboration was required. The message was clear. Drummond remained immovable, a bastion of discipline and honor. The two aides flanking Harrow, sensing the finality of the king's voice, stepped back immediately, hands clasped neatly. Behind them, retreating into the shadows of ceremonial hierarchy, Harrow, now stripped of his theatrics and authority in this moment, turned without ceremony and walked quickly toward the platform stairs. Each step was brisk, measured, his clipboard clutched like a talisman he no longer believed would protect him. The crowd didn't erupt in cheers, didn't hiss or murmur in derision. They simply watched him depart. This was not entertainment. It was history being quietly, immutably made. The man who had attempted to bend a soldier to his will had, instead, been the one humbled. The visual irony did not go unnoticed by the press. Cameras continued to click, capturing images that would run in headlines across the globe. The advisor defeated not by confrontation or force, but by the steadfastness of duty and the courage of a boy. George turned back to Drummond, offering a nod. Subtle, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. It conveyed 1,000 unspoken words: acknowledgement, respect, gratitude, and solidarity. Drummond could not respond, not with a nod, not with a glance, not with any outward gesture. Protocol. Forbade it. Yet within that silence, communication passed completely. Recognition, understanding, respect. In that fleeting connection, a prince had spoken, a king had sanctioned, and a soldier still stood exactly where duty demanded. No fanfare accompanied this resolution. No sudden announcement, no dramatic lighting shift. The ceremony continued, but subtly transformed. The brass band began again, the first tentative notes seeming to question whether the occasion had survived the unexpected confrontation. Slowly, rhythm and confidence returned. Drums fell into line, horns lifted their voices, and the cadence of pageantry resumed as if remembering how to breathe. But everything had changed. Prince George lingered a moment longer, his gaze returning to Drummond's shoulder, imprinting the scene on his memory. Every polished shoe, every shadowed scar, every line of authority seemed sharper, more significant now. He understood instinctively that this was not a lesson in rebellion, nor in spectacle, but in principle. Duty and moral clarity had outlasted ambition and manipulation.